Okay, thank you very much, Artem. Once again, great that you are here. It's been a long time that we should have met, and finally, you're here at our seminar. So now I would like to give the floor to you so that you will present yourself better than I would do it, and talk about your topic of presentation for today.
Great, sure. Well, actually, I intended to present the first slide with the long and very boring list of my titles. I think I'm not going to do it. I just say that my primary affiliation is with the Department of Politics and Governments here at Faculty of Social Sciences at HST University. Yeah, I have other affiliation, but they're not that important for our conversation. And yes, my primary research focus is applications of various network analysis techniques to various issues of political science and international relations.
Okay, great. So, do you have your slides? Would you like to show us something?
Yeah, sure. Let me set up my presentation. Can you see it?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah, should I give the floor to you for some more introductory words? Because quite frankly, my invitation to your wonderful seminar series was not without lots of details. My colleague Lika Kapustina just invited me to tell anything about my and my colleagues' current research. But if you want to maybe guide me for some specific focus, because my presentation is rather broad, and I would gladly talk about a number of various issues, either methodological or theoretical. So if you have some good wishes for me how to proceed,
oh well, actually,
appreciate that.
Yeah, actually, not so many wishes. We are just happy to see the colleagues who are working in the field of social network analysis. And this is pretty funny that sometimes we are working like door to door, probably not door to door, but okay, quite close to each other, and we do not know about each other's works. And the intention of our lab now is to somehow find these people and these colleagues, and to somehow unify this field and just to know who is who. And yeah, it's great that many researchers are working in different aspects of social network analysis, and that's why it's really so interesting to know what you're working on. So that's why I think your broad representation of your work would be really very important and interesting for us. And we especially invited some of, I mean, of course, we invited everybody from the lab, and also we made some invitations in our channels. And also we know that some people who came, they are from political science. So I think it might be, oh, dear colleagues, someone has microphone turned on. It's not time to say goodbye yet. We are just starting. Yeah, so I think it would be really of an interest of many people from the lab. And the beauty of social network analysis is actually that you can apply the same methods in different areas. So that's why if you are using some interesting methods, so probably it can be also applied to other spheres. So yeah, you're very welcome, and we are glad that you're here.
Yep, thank you very much for having me. And I think that's actually a very great and very useful endeavor to kind of have networking for people who work with networks. I have a favorite saying in Russian, "Поймать в сети." And I think that it's useful to us to catch each other into our nets, so we can maybe advance our understanding of state-of-the-art net analysis techniques. And my personal experience with network analysis is that it's quite a developed field. Well, in compared to something like regression analysis, you have both statistical and mathematical base formulated 30 years ago, and there's nothing that you can do. There's nothing that you can prove, and you're just kind of using the same old tricks. Well, it's completely not the same thing with network analysis, and you actually find yourself in quite an opposite place. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later in my presentation, where you basically have a number of competing network analysis techniques, where the academic community itself is not really sure which is better, what kind of approach is better, and we are still working out what works best for our research tasks that we face every day. Okay, I think I'm not going to waste any more of your time with introductory stuff, I hope. So I'm just going to go straight into my presentation summary, my presentation brief. Well, I was generally asked to talk about the applications of social network analysis in political science and international relations. And I'm going to do just that. I'm going to give you a short dive into the history of methodology, how actually guys in political science and IR actually started to use these techniques. I'm going to provide you empirical, practical overview of political networks, what kind of networks we actually face in political science, what is a political network, and what kind of research task we can put forward when we face such networks. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about the problem of dyadic design, dyadic research design. I'm not sure whether the crowd here is familiar. I have quite limited understanding on the current lab's endeavors. As far as I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, obviously, your focus is mostly connected to descriptive network analysis, which is maybe a little bit like, wouldn't say distant, but kind of like parallel to maybe more statistical tasks that a lot of social sciences face when they try to do what we call inferential studies, inferential research. But especially specifically in IR, the dyadic design problem is a very loud thing that happened approximately 10 years ago, and it's still being hotly debated and discussed in IR community. Then I'm going to actually present the inferential network analysis as a subfield of network analysis, and I would like to distinguish, eliminate the fact that my focus is inferential network analysis. I have quite limited understanding of a lot of advanced descriptive techniques, so this is kind of area we can probably collaborate somewhere in the future. But I'm going to present my current understanding of inferential network analysis techniques and their application in political science and IR. And finally, I'm going to give you a number of examples of my ongoing studies and research in various fields that actually apply these techniques to solve various tasks and problems that we face in various fields of IR political science. Okay, yeah, I lied when I told that I wasn't going to present myself more. I'm still going to talk a few words about my current affiliations. Oh, I think that's the wrong slide. Yeah, well, as I said, well, my primary affiliation is social sciences, Department of Political Science and Governance. I also work with other universities such as Shining-UQAM, YMOR, and participate in various research projects. I'm telling you this useless information only to kind of like prove that I'm actually worthy of sharing with you my experience of engaging in network analysis in various research tasks. And I think that one of the insights that I got working in various projects on quite unrelated research problems is that really my conclusion is that networks are really a thing that exists everywhere. They connect everyone, different actors, different processes, and you can actually conceptualize a lot of different political processes as networks in quite unusual situations. And actually, one of the ongoing theme of my research, and a number of papers that I work on that are not empirical and practical in nature, but methodological, basically state that our kind of traditional understanding of a social network as a network that connects people, organizations, states, and other actors is maybe kind of limited, and we probably should actually broaden our understanding of network to incorporate a lot of immaterial notions such as discourses, rhetorical artifacts, ideas, and other related stuff, but more on that later. So let's talk a little bit about political science and social network analysis. To be fair, to be completely honest with you, and a lot of my colleagues like to criticize me that since I'm a network analysis guy, there is a very good proverb in Russian that if you have a hammer, then every task at your disposal suddenly turns into a nail. Если у тебя в руках молоток, все кажется гвоздем. And I think this kind of like self-criticism is kind of useful in political science, because a lot of established political science paradigms, specifically things like institutionalism, is not really a network thing. And actually, while obviously there are a lot of network-related studies in political science that goes back into the 1970s, etc., but really as a general understanding that we can actually put forward a number of research tasks and actually conceptualize different processes. In terms of networks, only started to actually coalesce into something coherent somewhere in 2000s. And a lot of fields like comparative political science, like obviously political theory, something like, interestingly enough, political sociology. For me, that was kind of a unique experience when I discovered that compared to like general sociology, political sociology doesn't really love to incorporate networks in various tasks. Curiously enough, studies in political culture do, but political culture, political sociology, and political science are kind of like also parallel developments, parallel traditions. But if we would try to look for something that we might call a trace or a root, some kind of core, a seed for integrating social network analysis into political theory, into theories of various political processes, then in my opinion, there are three subfields, subdisciplines in political science that actually played with network theoretical ideas starting somewhere from 1980s, I think. First of all, it's public policy studies subfield. In Russian, it's теория применения политических решений. Basically, it's a subfield of political science that deals with policy making, with creating, formulating, and accepting, and then implementing various policies in various fields like social policy, economic policy, security policy, etc. And here we have two relatively established paradigms that rely a lot on network conceptualization of various interactions and processes that take place during various stages and during various parts of policymaking process. These are Advocacy Coalition Framework, ACF, and obviously policy network approach. More on that a little bit later. Also, starting somewhere from the 1990s, there is a very growing and improving, advancing approach in legislative studies, which is basically called network approach to legislative process. This is an idea that we can actually study legislation and policy making within the frames of parliament through network and obviously through network analysis. And also a couple of political psychology and political culture studies also played with network ideas, but as far as I know, the literature these are still mostly theoretical thought experiments, but not the tradition, not the framework, not something established. And I think that it's kind of important because not very often we see huge paradigm shifts in a lot of established fields in various social sciences, and political science is not an exception. We still work with theories that were proposed 30, 40 years ago, and we have political science, this notion. I think some of my students actually here in this conference, they might recall the notion of path dependency. The idea that a lot of institutions, they are kind of inertial, they're slow, they don't like to change. And I think that, and it's not only my opinion, and a lot of contemporary authors in various fields that I've just mentioned, they also say similar things. That actually political science as a discipline and its subfields may benefit a lot from integrating social network analysis, not just as method, not just as a tool that we can use to explain various interactions, but as a theoretical notion, as a concept that might be useful in trying to understand how and why various processes unravel. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. First example is the above-mentioned advocacy coalition framework. I think currently in public policy studies, ACF is one of three leading approaches, three leading paradigms. Excuse me. The other two are veto actor paradigm and multiple streams paradigm. And advocacy coalition framework is basically the idea, and I'm going to simplify this the entire theoretical paradigm, which has dozens of, if not hundreds of theoretical papers reading about it. But in general, the intuitive idea behind advocacy coalition framework is the idea that to actually produce any kind of policy, each political system in every country needs to build an advocacy coalition behind it. So various actors such as interest groups, various state agencies, executives, legislatives, various, as we call them in Russian, принимающие решения, decision makers, they need to interact with each other to build coalition that would provide various resources. These resources might refer to institutional influence, legitimation, normative ideas that can be put behind to justify any kind of policy, financial resources to support the implementation of any specific policy. And when taken together, these coalitions interacting with each other, sharing resources, produce a specific established policy. And to understand why a specific policy come into existence, why, for instance, a specific reform is being implemented in a specific country. One of the very popular research example is pension reform in Germany, where they were discussing, quite similar to Russian experience, various ideas and policy projects, how to develop their pension program, and various groups, including political parties, IGOs, NGOs, various institutional actors, they all interacted with each other to produce a specific policy. And so you might ask, where do the networks come into play? And obviously, if you try to model these complex interactions as a coherent system, you basically conceptualize this structure, this institution, as a complex network. And a lot of current studies actually try to model these networks empirically using different techniques, including formal coding, including various techniques of discourse network analysis, etc. But in the end, they produce a complex multimode networks that might include nodes, actors from multiple networks and actors of a different kind. You might, for instance, have people and organization within the same network, representing nodes of various type. And then you can try to model the structure of such network, and first of all, try to explain this network. Or you might apply various techniques of descriptive network analysis. For instance, you can calculate various metrics of centralities, various assessments of centralities to then try to, for instance, explain, statistically predict the probability of any kind of policy of being accepted or implemented. The second approach, also implemented in public policy studies, this approach is more kind of like if ACF is something quite new. Well, it was obviously proposed in the end of 1970s, early 1980s, but the explosion of popularity happened somewhere around 1990s, while policy networks approach is more older perspective. It was first proposed somewhere in 1970s and became popular in 1980s. And the idea behind policy networks approach is the idea that various, and also like just keep in mind and take it with a huge buckets of salt, that I'm simplifying everything just to give you a general idea of where the theory is going. And so the general idea behind policy networks approach is the idea that any policy-making technique, any policy-making project actually consists of not a singular separated policy project or policy solution or policy program, but rather various networks connecting different policies. For instance, you can have a pension reform, which might be connected to, for instance, taxation reform. And these policies might come into conflict with each other. They might strengthen each other. And one of the ideas behind policy approach is the notion that you can model the structure of a complex reform through the lens of network. I must put your attention to the fact that since these theories were developed mostly in 1980s, 1990s, these were not a period of time where descriptive network analysis, and for instance, like things like social network analysis has become very popular in social sciences as a whole. And here, especially if we talk about political science, as far as I know, sociology was kind of like first to adopt a lot of network analysis ideas and techniques. Political science was kind of like late to the party, a little bit later to the party. But initially, when these theories were proposed, they suggested to model those networks not as formal empirical structures. So they were not like playing with matrices, graphs, etc. They were mostly using case study approach, where they basically manually collected information about a specific policy or a specific coalition, and then they tried to basically model a case through the framework of networks. But starting from 2000s, actually things changed, and especially in the ACF approach, a lot of contemporary empirical researchers started to actually use various network analysis techniques to model the same concepts and the same political systems that were just described in the form of cases only 20 years before. Okay, moving on. Let's talk a little bit about network approach to legislative process. This is also kind of a new theoretical approach. It mostly grew up, matured somewhere beginning from the late 2000s. Once again, my explanation, I'm not a legislative study nerd, so to speak. I have kind of limited understanding of, well, limited is not the right word. My interactions with legislative studies were mostly as an invited network scientist. So obviously I know the literature, but I don't know the history of this approach to the last paper. But as far as I know, this approach only matured somewhere in 2000s. This was we can explain it mostly through the lack of tools and solutions to actually implement various network analysis techniques to explain various processes that take place in legislatives in parliaments. But obviously, since legislation involves interaction of various deputies, various parliament members, PMs, parliament legislature is a thing that is a very intuitively can be quite intuitively be understood as a network, and therefore when the tools were available, become available, there had been an explosion of studies devoted to things like factors of successful legislation. How can we explain successes and failures in producing a legislation? Also, there has been a growth in research devoted to various parliamentary faction coalitions, how various factions in the parliament interact with each other, how factors like polarization and leadership influence the formation of these coalitions. This is especially relevant for the study of parliamentary democracies, where the government is being produced through coalition building between different parliamentary factions. Also, there has been the rise of studies trying to understand the co-authorship networks in social political communities of the deputies, how different connections between interest groups, communities, regions, etc., influence parliamentary collaboration between members of parliament. And finally, there is a growing field of research devoted to various structural determinants of legislative co-sponsorship. Basically, this is the idea that through structural network dynamics, we can explain why different deputies, different members of parliament actually cooperate with each other to produce legislation in the parliament. Okay, let's talk a little bit about IR, which is in Russian теории международных отношений. There is a lot of disagreements on whether we conceptualize IR as a part of political science or, oh my God, this is a wrong slide. Yeah, that's it. There is a debate whether we should consider international relations IR as a part of political science or as a different sub-discipline of social sciences. My opinion is that this distinction is a little bit unnatural, and although it's really true that these disciplines, they developed in parallel to each other, and a lot of IR theories, they're not really applicable to political science and vice versa. For instance, classic IR theories, they mostly don't take into account domestic politics, while a lot of classic political science theories and main paradigms in comparative political science does not take into account national politics a lot, mostly. But in recent decades, we are seeing a lot of interaction between those two disciplines. And actually, it's my opinion as a political scientist who work mostly with issues of international security, I don't really see how you can actually diverge these two fields, and they really should be studied as a whole, in my opinion, at least. But In IR, the situation with network theory is a little bit better, where in political science really don't see any coherent paradigm that would try to incorporate network structures and network ideas into mainstream political theory. In comparison to that, in IR, we're actually seeing, especially since the late 1980s, we're seeing growing interest towards statistical modeling of international relations as a network structure. And I would say that starting from early 2010s, especially after various problems with statistical didactic design have been identified and rigorously debated in mainstream academic literature, now after some influential publications made by really respected and leading theories such as Zeev, Maoist, etc., they basically propelled integration of network theory into broader IR. Okay, let's distance ourselves from the boring domain of theory and talk a little bit about practical stuff. Where do you actually, where can you actually find political networks, and what is the empirical stuff that might be explained and operationalized through networks? And obviously, I think the first and most intuitive response to that is the idea of the notion of international relations network. Obviously, if we try to model various international interactions, global politics as a whole, you would see that you can't really, obviously you can, but you shouldn't. You should not study individual interactions between individual countries, bilateral interaction between individual countries, without taking into account the structure of international system as a whole. For instance, here on the slide, you have an example of international network of technology diffusion, basically how various states share with each other military defense technologies, things like, for instance, blueprints for military jets, tanks, etc. And you can really see on the slide, you have an example of a network from 1964. And you can clearly see that individual connections between countries, they all are heavily dependent on the bipolar structure of international relations. We have a Western bloc, we have an Eastern bloc, we have two superpowers, United States and the Soviet Union. And these superpowers, they basically dominate and influence a lot their allies, satellite states, etc., etc., etc. And for instance, if you try to predict statistically the probability of United States supplying military technology to a country like Iran or China, obviously you need to take into account the fact that US would consider the structure of international alliances, the structure of various conflicts, competition, etc., 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 and then they would try to structure and they would take decisions on, for instance, supplying or not supplying military technology to other states based on the structure of the entire international network. And here we have the example of, on the left side of the slide, you can see this like simpler toy example of a sub-network between the United States, China, North Korea, France, and Iran. And you can clearly see triadic closure effects that influence the decision of the United States to engage into new interactions with other nations, other states. Okay, moving from the international politics into domestic politics, into local of various political systems, regimes, etc. We can also see that a lot of institutions and the entire political system as a whole might be conceptualized as a network. The most obvious example of this is obviously the notion of parliament network, legislation network. For instance, here on the slide, you can see the network of legislation bill sponsorship in the Russian State Duma during the 7th convocation. This graph is from my latest research with Nikita Zaripov, Andrei Zaripov, where we try to understand the reasons and structural determinants behind co-sponsorship of deputies in Russian State Duma. And we can clearly see that if you look at the Russian parliament, at the structure of interactions between individual deputies, we can clearly see that these interactions, they're not chaotic. They represent a part of whole structural system. For instance, we have various clusters. You can probably guess that the biggest cloud here on the right side of the graph is United Russia cluster. We also see Communist KPRF party cluster. We can see in the orange Справедливая Россия cluster. And we're seeing that the structure of these clusters is relatively different. For instance, the United Russia cluster is actually, well, you can kind of see this like blob, the cloud of different nodes, but you can clearly see that these nodes are made of different colors. These are a green color cluster and blue color cluster. This is one of the puzzles and interesting questions that we are trying to solve over the last 2 years. We're trying to basically understand why United Russia, when you look from the framework of sponsorship, actually divides into these 2 groups. We're trying to understand what kind of factors influence these diversions in the parliament. But the general point that I'm trying to make here is the idea that actually a lot of different interactions between institutions within the framework of a greater institution or within the framework of a political system as a whole can be represented as a network structure. And various topological features of such a structure actually influence the behavior and actions and decisions that are being made within those institutions, systems, etc. Moving on, I've mentioned that traditional understanding of political network is the idea that you have a number of actors like deputies, institutions, states, and they interact with each other. But actually, you can model a lot of other things as a network. For instance, within the framework of advocacy coalition theory, there is this growing idea of modeling policy debates as dynamic networks, and various leading scientists on this in this field they propose to model policy issues and various policy ideas and first actually produce through the lenses of network analysis. And the idea behind DNA, network analysis, is that you can look at political rhetoric that is actually produce guys like deputies, policymakers, political leaders, presidents, etc. And then you can code the rhetoric into a number of concepts or rhetoric. There's a lot of debate on how we actually do it. What is this canal we are discussing HSC and beyond. But as a whole, there is this general notion that we can actually model rhetorical interaction. while connectivity ratios between actors and concepts. For instance, you can have two clouds, two clusters of concepts. One cloud might be associated, for instance, with left-leaning rhetoric, while the other cloud would be associated with right-leaning. And then you can kind of see what actors is connected to one cloud or another cloud, and through this analyzing those connections, you can kind of like applying various techniques of modifiers. You can understand why how agents relate with each other or do not relate with each other.
Sorry, you're lagging a bit, and we cannot hear you now.
Yeah, I thought it's my problem, but is it Artem on Artem's side?
Yes, it's common problem, I guess.
Ah, okay, because I'm just sitting and trying to connect to another network because I thought that it's on my side. Yeah, okay, so then we should wait a little bit. Yeah, so Artem will come again. Okay. Okay, we can discuss how it is going. I think it's really a nice lecture for now. It's really interesting to see how how in different areas social network analysis is applied. So Olga, would you connect Artem, or how should we do it?
Yeah, I'll text him now.
Okay, meanwhile, probably we can discuss if someone has implemented some of the approaches that Artem was describing. I know that there are some of political scientists among us. So we see that Artem is coming. As for me, I have seen a lot of research, not a lot, but some usually on the conferences. For example, Artem, you're here. Great.
Yeah, I'm really sorry for technical problems. Unfortunately, Wi-Fi here in HSC is not a very stable thing, so
yeah,
I had to reconnect. Yeah,
okay, great.
I'm going to continue, and I'm seeing that I'm talking for more than 45 minutes already, and I think I bored you to death, so I'm going to speed up. Okay. Yeah. So the general
we
notion.
start somewhere here.
So yeah, the general notion is that you can also structure not actors themselves, but you can also structure concepts. You can kind of understand what kind of concept, idea, or symbol in rhetoric is central, what kind of symbols are used to connect other symbols, and maybe connect various clusters with each other. And through this lens, you can also better understand political rhetoric itself. And here on the right part of the slide is the example from my ongoing research that I'm doing with Sukhan related to the rhetoric of Russian national security agenda in 2014 and 2015, where we try to explain connections between symbols of Russian security policy and various policymakers, and we can kind of see what kind of clusters connects various members of Russian Security Council, and what kind of symbols are central for Russian national security rhetoric as a whole. Okay, moving on. I think one of the big promises of network analysis, and the reason why I think in the coming decade we would see more and more network studies in political science and IR, is the growing number and the growing quantity of empirical data that is presented in the network form. And here we have an example of a Talisman natural language processing data collection system that is developed jointly by MGIMO University and Institute for Systemic Programming, Institute Системного программирования RAN. But here in HSC we have a similar system called IFORA. Probably some of you maybe heard about that, or maybe some of you heard about the global database of events, language, and tone project, which try to code various events, including political events that happen in international and domestic politics of different states, using natural language processing of public news data. And here you can basically construct a data set, or actually it's an array. It could be an array of different data set on different units of analysis, such as states, actors, institutions, etc. And when you start to connect these actors with institutions, you are basically creating a structure that is network in nature. I would take the example from the slide with a grain of salt, because my colleagues in MGIMO, they have specific perspective on different things. I'm quite amused by examples like George Soros being an actor in Ukrainian politics, but this is one of the leading studies that my colleagues from Institute международных исследований ИМИ, MGIMO, Institute for International Studies, MGIMO, are pursuing. I consolidate them on the subject of various network analysis techniques. And they try to understand how interactions between non-state actors and state actors actually shape important decisions in both internal politics and obviously international politics of Ukraine and other states, other nations, other countries. Yeah, and the thing is that due to the explosion and advancement of big data mining techniques based on natural processing, we're getting more and more data on interactions between different levels of actors, which might, and I think that the only good way of actually modeling these complex relationships is through network analysis. And therefore, I think that empirical large N studies that being proposed in the crossroads between political science and IR, studies that would try to connect IR and political science, and for instance, try to connect various internal institutional factors within the state and various structural factors of international politics as a whole, would have to rely on the network analysis techniques to basically integrate factors on different levels of analysis. Here we can see an example of such a network. For instance, one of the recent, this study is basically an experimental study. It's not a theoretical study. So the study tries to propose the idea of modeling international relations as a multi-mode network that have interactions between IGOs, states, and between IGOs and between states separately. And here, and I think a lot of you can actually imagine any international network that connects actors from different layers and different levels. And international relations theory is quite clear that these levels interact with each other. And now, due to the expansion of network analysis techniques, we can kind of model those relationships and those processes as an integrated common system. I'm going to speed up and maybe skip a number of slides to stay in a relatively adequate time, I hope. But I'm going to shortly speak about problem of didactic design. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but if you would look at IR theory in the 1980s and 1970s, a long time ago, scientists suggested to model interactions between various, for instance, states with the use of large N, so large number, statistical studies that relied mostly on multivariate or logistic and other kinds of regression analysis models. And these models would try to basically model, sorry for repeating myself, try to predict the relationship between a number of attributes of a dyad or pair of countries or other actors through the use of various individual or dyadic, monadic, or dyadic covariates or predictive factors. And then probably most of you are aware of the basic math that is behind regression analysis. Here I'm going to put a very, very short reminder that you have this equation that tries to calculate some dependent variable through a linear equation with some independent variable. And obviously, one of the basic assumptions of regression analysis is the independence of your observation. The idea that all of those y's, y's should be taken independently from each other. And this basic assumption, which also influences the assumption of normality, the assumption of the lack of autocorrelation, obviously does not work within the framework of didactic design, because, for instance, in the international system, as we discussed before, you have countries influencing one another, and you have a lot of structural effects like triads or maybe more complex structures, effects like reciprocity, mutuality, effects of centrality. They all influence the behavior of actors within the system. And therefore, if you try to apply contemporary standard regression analysis techniques, you just violate your Gauss-Markov assumption, and you end up in a situation where your estimates that you get are biased and inefficient and not effective. Basically, they have high variance. If some of you are not familiar with the notions of variance or bias, you can kind of see the example here on the slides, where in one instance you have relatively precise estimates that are biased, with basically they're moved away from the true center of those parameters, while in case of high variance you have this like you have a lack of precision in your estimates. And these problems, they all significantly affect traditional regression models in international relations. And thus, starting from 2000s and later, basically a lot of leading IR theorists and especially empirical researchers, scientists, they admitted that classic logistic and multivariate regressions, they're not applicable to the models of international interactions, international relations. And by the way, the same goes to other didactic designs. For instance, want to try to model co-sponsorship of bills in the parliament. You can't use traditional regression without various adjustments. And starting from 2010s, in the empirical, in political science as a whole, and in
network analysis as a methodological discipline. There is a lot of progress in developing various inferential network analysis techniques. For those who don't know, inferential network analysis and network analysis that tries to produce statistical inference. The statistical inference is the idea that if two statistical variables covariate with each other, so the change in statistical change in one variable coincides with the change in another parameter, this might be an indication of a causal relationship. And this jump from statistical inference to causal inference is basically the core of any inferential statistical study. And starting from, I think, the middle of 2000, and this approach got speed. Starting from 2010s, we are seeing explosion of various different inferential analysis techniques. Most notably, of course, various models of exponential random graph model, but also methods like stochastic actor-oriented model, things like ANR, additive and multiplicative effects network model, and also other techniques and approaches. Some of them are quite experimental, and you need a supercomputer, or like advanced tensor models, for instance. They require a lot of processing power. And I would say that even a lot of, for instance, exponential random graph models, they also require a substantial amount of quantitative power. But these methods are only being developed with the last decade, and they're still being debated, improved, and they are only in the maybe early stage of their evolution. And I'm going to skip over this slide because I've already discussed the reasons why we need network analysis in political science. But I'm going to focus on a number of interesting examples that we can kind of use to model various processes in international relations. First thing that I want to mention is the idea that a lot of interesting insights from the international relationship might be produced through descriptive methods. And a lot of these descriptive methods, they don't need anything more complex than a simple Gephi software and a database. I think all of you are aware with Gephi software. It's basically 101 for network analysis, and it's very easy to learn and study this software. You only need a couple of hours to basically get into this program. And using even this very simple software, you can kind of produce very interesting results. For instance, you probably heard that in IR, there is a lot of discussions about various international orders. You've heard things like multipolar order, bipolar order, etc., etc., etc. But if you would ask any, especially Russian IR theorists, and if you would ask him to quantify the relationship, it would be kind of hard. And you're probably asking me to stop already because I've spoken for over an hour. Should I wrap up?
Oh, no, I just have a question. I will ask it after your presentation then.
Yeah. Let's just like discuss various questions after the end of the presentation. I'm really near the end. So here in this example, you can see how you can model the network of international military deployments, and this is one of my ongoing research that I currently work on. We have collected a data set of various international military missions. These might include peacekeeping operations, various counterinsurgency operations, etc., etc., etc. And one of the first things that we've done, just using the very simple Gephi software, is that we've obviously quantified various centrality measures for different observations of such a network in different periods of time. And then we've calculated the maximum measure of modularity for each single graph starting from 1985 to 2020. And as you probably know, modularity measure basically tells you that the higher the modularity measure is, the stronger the intergroup connections within your cluster, and the weaker are connections between the clusters. So if you have an international network or a network with a high modularity measure, that will tell you that various clusters, they interact with each other quite actively, but they don't interact between each other. This is basically the situation with the example of bipolar international system, where you have the USSR and the United States, two blocks. They compete with each other, they conflict with each other, but they do not cooperate with each other a lot. And therefore, we are observing a lot of connections within those clusters, but we're not observing connections between the clusters. And using this modularity measure, you can kind of trace how the international system, for instance, the system of international military deployments, how the system evolve over time. And here we're seeing on the graph to the left, we're seeing the change in the international system between the 1980s and the 1990s. Obviously, USSR collapsed, the Cold War has ended, and we're seeing that countries stop behaving this bipolar nature, and they started to interact with each other. And this very precise and very strong clusterization of the international network basically collapsed. And now we're seeing the situation on the right, where you still have some clusters, you still have countries that tend to interact with each other more than with their rivals. You are seeing United States cluster, Russia cluster, China cluster, etc. But we're seeing that these clusters, they are related with each other. They interact with each other a lot. And using this theoretical approach, you can kind of trace how international system evolves and how these indications of polarization, how they basically reveal itself. And I think it's very interesting, and it provides a lot of interesting insights for developing, for instance, realists, neoliberal theory of international relations that try to unravel, understand cooperation, conflicts in the network, etc. Okay, and wrapping up my presentation, I'm really going to wrap it up. I'm not going to bombard you with mathematics of exponential and graph models, and I actually believe that many of you might already be aware with these techniques. But moving on from descriptive network analysis, the idea behind contemporary statistical network models is the notion that you can try to understand and statistically explain individual ties, connections in the network through modeling the entire network as a whole statistical random event. That's basically the name of the method, exponential graph model. You have a network graph, and you treat this network as a random process, as a random structure, and then you try to statistically explain the probability of observing a network with a number of specific topological and nodal features and characteristics. There are various inferential network analysis techniques that are based or not based on exponential mathematics. I think that the two of the most important techniques are TRGM and SAOM, basically temporal exponential random graph models, stochastic actor-oriented models. These are methods that are developed to actually model a network over time, so you can kind of trace how various changes in the international system accumulate over time. For instance, and that's just only one of the many things that these techniques might actually do. I would just briefly make a remark that there is a very strong and very funny, in my opinion, methodological debate between SAOM proponents and TRGM proponents. And basically, the authors they engage in a holy war with each other, so to speak. They bombard each other with very, very critical articles, and you can just like read the titles of the title of the papers, things like errors in empirical sound TRGM comparison, and a lot of very, very harsh criticism from one team to another team and vice versa. And we have this, there is no clear consensus of, for instance, which method is better. And I think this is very interesting, and this is very good for us social scientists, because we can kind of use these techniques and compare these techniques using our empirical data and kind of contribute into this debate. And to maybe finally wrap up this presentation, I would say that contemporary inferential network analysis techniques, they allow you to model complex interactions of different networks with each other. For instance, here we have this very foundational research made by, oh my God, I forgot his name. Obviously, his surname is Wagner. I think his name is Peter Wagner, but I might be wrong. But this scientist, this researcher, he proposed to model the co-evolution of alliance, conflict, and democratization networks. And he showed that dynamical processes within the alliance network influences networks of conflicts and democratization, and vice versa. And in my recent studies, I've basically tried to apply similar approach. I've tried to combine in one model different political and geo-economic factors that might drive different countries to cooperate with each other. And I also used various structural effects that reveal itself with the system. For instance, one of the basic effects that I'm trying to use is the effect called brokerage, or in mathematical term, we call this effect geometrically weighted edgewise shared partners. I'm not going to explain why do we geometrically weight these effects. I'm not going to dive into the problems of degeneracy, etc., etc., etc. But I'm just going to focus your attention on the fact that when applying these techniques, you can combine predictors on individual levels of countries, things like the economic power of a country, things like military might of a country. You can also take into account various dyadic parameters, things that reveal the relationship between a specific pair of countries, like things like dyadic trade, bilateral trade, or a presence of a defense agreement, alliance agreement between two countries. And you can also use these structural effects that are either endogenous to the network in case of TRGM or ERGM. And in case of stochastic object-oriented model, you can also even model exogenous effects, exogenous structural effect of one network upon another network. And I think this is very interesting because it allows us to model a number of networks. For instance, we can model 3 or 2 networks and trace complex causality relationship between those networks. For instance, here at the example, we can see that transfers of military technology positively influence military deployments. So basically, states that share military technology with each other are more likely to engage in the common military deployment. They're more likely to deploy troops into other countries, into other similar countries. For instance, if, I don't know, Russia shares its military technology with China, the probability that Russia would also send troops into China would rise. And we can kind of combine the structural effects, the coevolution effects, dyadic and monadic predictors into one model, and thus take into take into account all of these factors, and thus basically solve a lot of embedded variable bias problems, solve a lot of incorrect specification problems, etc. Yeah, and you can kind of see that you can use these models to model not only international networks, but also various domestic politics networks. For instance, here's the example of our recent research of bills sponsorship in Russian State Duma, where we kind of try to understand and see what factors influence sponsorship activity within the Russian parliament. And this is a very interesting and ongoing research, because we found that our model had relatively limited predictive power. And we believe that there are a lot of different factors that also influence the sponsorship behavior of the deputies. And thus, we are now trying to integrate discourse network analysis techniques into like this more classic inferential network analysis framework to try to understand how discourse coalition influence sponsorship behavior. And I think this is the beauty of inferential network analysis, because it allows you to statistically model the influence of one network upon another network. Okay, I think I will wrap up here. I think already spent more than an hour. This was a very, very long presentation. I hope that I have not bored you to death. And if you are interested with any of the topics that I've brought to your attention, I would pretty appreciate any kind of comments, questions, and anything that you would like to share. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, Artem, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that we have questions here. So I see the hand. So Artem, is it our Artem? Yes. with the
Yes,
question.
it is our Artem
Okay,
to
yes.
our foreign colleague Artem. A question that I tried to ask you during the presentation, but I think that now it is a better time to do this. So could you please move back to the slide with network modularity?
Yeah, sure. One moment.
You skipped it. You've skipped it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Excuse me. This one or the next one?
The next one, yes.
Right.
So I just want to
Oh, excuse me.
I just want to clarify some conceptual underpinning of this modularity. Of course, I understand that this is the measure of basically clusterization, so to say, of the network. But in case of cross-national, so to say, governmental relations that are that, for example, Cold War was the case, like these alliances and so on. So if you measure the relations between countries as, for example, trade or something like that, then it would imply that there will be a higher modularity, like in some historical periods, for example, at the height of Cold War. But what if you measure their relations as rivalries, so like military interventions and so on? This would imply that countries within some ground truth communities, so to say, these geopolitical blocks, they would have very little connections, these rivalries within, and more rivalries across their blocks. So this would mean that the modularity score will be lower compared to when we measure their countries' relations as, so to say, positive ties. So could you explain, please, how this conceptual underpinning of how we treat ties will depend on modularity? We can't hear you.
I suggest to wait a little bit. It looks like this is the same problem as it was before.
Oh man, I'm really sorry. I once again experienced
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Wi-Fi failure. Yeah, I'm really sorry. So yeah, let me just get straight to the point. One moment, I'm going to open my screen again. Yeah, so first of all, this is a very great question. This is a very good question. And when I was presenting similar presentation to the political science crowd, they were very skeptical and they were very about interpreting modularity measure as a measure of polarization, because we are not really, you need to justify why the lack or why the presence of a tie actually represents antagonistic relationship between nodes. So yeah, we can use modularity to try to explain polarization, but you need to do it carefully. And now moving on maybe to the core of your question. Yes, first of all, the interpretation of modularity will be closely tied to the nature of a network that you're trying to model. Obviously, if you model the network of conflicts, then I'm not really sure that there is a very clear substantial interpretation of modularity measure. I wouldn't actually, I wouldn't be sure what kind of measure modularity would represent. Probably modularity would represent countries that tie together within a specific conflict or within a specific region, but I'm not sure whether this knowledge would give us any interesting insights. And also, if you would look, if you, for instance, compare networks that are devoted to defense, security cooperation, and trade cooperation, you would obviously see that modularity measures, even during the Cold War time, would be vastly different. So states would either, they would cooperate a lot in one field, in one sphere, but they would not cooperate in other sphere. And for instance, United States would gladly sell Coca-Cola to Iran, but United States would not sell military missiles to Iran. And when you're trying to model two different networks, you need to be aware of what kind of interactions that you are trying to model and what kind of conclusions are you making from those measures. And here I'm just, the only argument that I try to make here is that Oh my God, I'm so sorry about that. Usually,
Yeah.
things are not that bad as usual. But I hope I've responded to your question.
I just wanted for you to clarify what does the decrease in network modularity on the picture that you presented tell us about the state of world affairs, so to say? Because
sure.
I don't really understand military deployment, because this can be both understood as like rivalry or as like help for our military allies.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think I'm just missing
So
your
I
question.
think this is just I just mixed up the conceptual part. Yeah.
Of course, yeah. Basically, we are modeling deployments here that represent various bases, missions, things like counterinsurgency missions, and you engage into various missions with your ally. It's not a network of conflict, it's a network of cooperation.
Okay.
Yeah, you might have instances where, for instance, the deployment represents an ongoing war or an ongoing frozen conflict. But the ratio of these instances are really, really small in comparison to peaceful defense cooperation. Regular things like military exercises, things like bases, like anti-piracy missions, UN missions, etc.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Artem, thank you very much. We have a couple more questions, so I suggest to go over them very quickly. So first of all, we have a question from Sergey. So I am copying this question in the chat. So this is the last question there. So are there any examples, possibilities of practical implementation of network analysis in policymaking? I mean, like a method in a data-driven policy paradigm. Does this method is useful not only for study political process, but also for making policy?
Yeah, exactly as I was explaining and talking about advocacy coalition framework, this is exactly the idea that you can explain and predict what kind of, for instance, political reform would be accepted and implemented in a specific polity, in a specific polity system. And yeah, basically there are examples of studies. I can share with you these studies over, I don't know, Telegram, email, whatever. But yeah, this is exactly the ongoing direction, which tries to explain policy making, how exactly policy is made, through the lens of network structure of these advocacy coalitions.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much, Artem. And I guess the last question was from Daria. So she has written in the chat. I'm copying once again as the last question there. So about the question is about the slides that you showed with the discourse analysis and affiliation network analysis for Ukraine. What are the means for the analysis there? Is it more a qualitative analysis? And continuation by Daria, as for the discourse, it seems like actors and terms, they are used on the same type in this network, isn't it? Like, yes, and continuation.
Yeah, sure. Discourse network analysis is a technique that was proposed by Philip Leyfield in the early 2010s. And this is basically a combination of classic discourse analysis and classic descriptive network analysis. So basically, on the first step, you take political rhetoric, for instance, statements, articles, any kind of rhetoric. And then you do personal qualitative coding, connecting actors and various symbols, concepts, and rhetorical ideas. And then when you code concepts and actors and connections between them, then you take this data and produce a network matrix from it. And obviously you can build and you can visualize it as a network graph. And then you can apply all kinds of traditional network analysis techniques, be it descriptive network analysis or inferential network analysis, to either explain the structure of the network or maybe even apply it as a dependent or independent variable in an inferential network analysis model. Yeah, and in regards to Daria's question, yeah, this kind of graph is a little bit primitive, because usually for DNA we use visualization software that allows to differentiate between the types of nodes. And in discourse network analysis, you can basically build 3 types of networks. You can build an independent network of actors, where the connections would be the share of the same actors, the same concepts, ideas, symbols, etc. You can build a network of symbols, and then the connections between symbols would be the number of actors that actually saying the same thing. And you can also have an integrated 2-mode network, when you have both connections between the actors and the concepts. In this working paper, in this working ongoing research, we're interested in both. We believe that both symbols of rhetoric and actors, they all act together to create indispensable integrated structure, united structure, so to speak. But obviously, we can actually do other things around, and we actually plan to explore different types of networks. We are going to work with symbols and actors separately as well.
Okay, Artem, thank you very much. So Daria, that was the question. I hope, yes, that you heard the answer. Yes. Well, dear all, we are here for 1.5 hours, Artem. So thank you very much. I think that if we have some requests or questions, additional questions, we may contact you and, for example,